Okay, today we are going to talk about elements and principles of art and design and how they look in three-dimensional works. It's a little different than looking at 2D pieces. So, what is three-dimensional art? Of course, this is work that has height, width, and depth. Little different than that 2D stuff. So the 2D just has height and width. So having that third dimension then, of course, makes it a form and makes it three-dimensional. The difference here is also that three-dimensional work can be functional, so you can use it, kind of like this dinner plate right here, or this Tiffany lamp, or even this apartment building. Or it can just be decorative, kind of being kind of sculptural, like this little hippo guy and this abstract piece over there. And then, of course, they can be both. So something like this can be useful, but also you can hang it on a wall and just admire it. How do you describe your work? So there's a couple different ways. So the first part is understanding what is the subject. So that is the image viewers can easily identify in a work of art. So as you look at the piece on the right by Dwayne Hansen, his title here is Tourists. There, the subject is purely what do you see? So in this instance, you see two people, and that's the subject. As for the content, that's the message. What is the artist trying to say? So it can be related to the subject matter, but it also can be the idea or emotion that artist is going for. Theme is another word for content. So, what is Dwayne Hansen trying to say? Well, he's kind of making a play. He's a British artist, and he's talking about stereotypical American tourists and kind of what he would envision. So, personally, when I look at this, I see my grandparents standing at the Grand Canyon. So he's kind of making a play on it. And then, of course, the media or the medium is those materials. So in this sense, down here, it says polyester resin and fiberglass painted in oil and mixed media. And then it's life size in London. So the media then is that polyester resin and fiberglass. So we've got 7 elements of art and design: form, space, line, shape, texture, color, and value. When we think of these, think of them as the parts of a piece of art. So you might think of it as words and sentences to a story. You could also think of it as ingredients when you're making like a nice cake. So the artists use those elements to create works of art. So the first one is form. That's going to be the most important one in a 3D class. It is that complete mass of an object. Shape we'll get to. Shape is flat. But the form, when we're looking at a sculpture, is the positive component of the sculpture. And then the space is everything else, kind of that negative element, which we'll get to. Form can be geometric. It can be organic. So this means kind of derived from math. This means derived from nature. It can have concave and convex areas. So concave, so think the word cave, little areas that go in, and convex are areas that protrude out. It can have static areas. It can be a static form. So like this right here, very boring, essentially. It doesn't feel, energetic, whereas this piece down here, very energetic. So if you have form, you have space. So form takes up space, and then everything else kind of exists around it. So when we talk about space, usually we're referring to negative space. It's the opposite of the mass. So it's the area above, below, around, and within a form. Sometimes you experience space by going into places. So like this cathedral. Sometimes you have just, holes, and we'll talk about that as being areas of negative space. You can also talk about the space between objects. And then sometimes the sculpture, the form is interesting, but sometimes the negative space is just as interesting as the form. Then you have line. So line's a little trickier in 3D art. When you draw, you understand line. You put your pencil on the page and you move it. It is a point set in motion. So you've made a line. In 3D, it can be an actual line. So you can talk about using wire a lot of times because it's longer than it is wider or thicker. But then you can have things that are linear. So this one here, this Brancusi piece is a linear form. And then you can have things that kind of you have to connect yourself. So these are called implied lines. So here with these boots kind of going off into the distance, it's kind of like when you're standing in the lunch line, you form a line. Shape. So shape is flat. Shape is, when we talk about it in sculpture, shape are the flat surfaces within a work. So sometimes when we work with clay, we talk about slabs and how we construct things. So they can also be geometric or they can be organic. But a lot of times we talk about shape when we're just talking about the flat sides of something. Usually when you're talking about the whole volume of the piece, we want to talk about its form. Texture. So texture, we perceive it through sight first, but then with 3D art, you can actually go up and touch it. So texture is that experience of touch and what we perceive with our hands. Texture, if it was a dark room, you could kind of tell what things felt like, and some things are deceiving. So like this is a little teacup covered in rabbit fur. And this one, although it looks like it's made out of fabric, is actually made out of clay. So that is kind of plays a trick on the eye. But just know it has to do with that sense of touch, that tactile sensation. And then color. So we'll get a little into color theory. The different thing about 3D art is that you can leave it the natural color of either the stone or the wood, or you can apply paint, apply dyes like in the glass and the fabric, or if it's a metal piece, you can apply something called a patina, and that changes the color of the metal. We'll get into color theory and different themes, but just know that color will affect the mood of the piece, okay? Whether it's a bright color or more earthen colors. And then we have value. So in sculpture, when we talk about value, we talk about light and shadow. So sculptures can be composed of light, kind of like down here at the 9/11 Memorial, or this Dan Flavin piece that has the light here. But you can also talk about it in relation to texture. So if a piece has a lot of texture and it's lit, you can see all the surfaces. Same here with La Pieta. You can see all the surfaces because of the texture. And it's, once again, it has to do with that light and shadow. And then sculpture has this fun eighth element called time and motion. So a painting or a drawing stays still. Sculptures can physically move. So we call those kinetic. They can move in three ways. Humans could move them, kind of like this piece down here. You kind of sit in the seat and go in circles. They can move by nature. So these pieces by Theo Jensen, they're wind propelled or water propelled, and they're huge and they move on the beach. Or they can be moved kind of by motors and kind of spin and revolve. All right, then we have our principles of art and design. So unity, contrast and variety, movement, repetition and pattern, rhythm, balance, emphasis, proportion, and scale. So before, when I was talking about the elements, I said, oh, these are like the words and sentences to your story. Well, the principles are like the grammar. You can ignore the rules of grammar, but no one's going to understand your story. It's going to be hard to read. Or when you're baking your cake, your elements are your ingredients. Your principles are the recipe. Once again, you could ignore the recipe for your cake, but it's probably not going to taste very good. So the artists use the principles to organize the elements of art. So the first one, the big one, is unity. And there's different ways to achieve unity, and those are listed here. But really it comes down to, does it feel whole? Does it feel complete? Is there a sense of similarity or togetherness or cohesion? It looks organized. So you can group things together. You can contain them just by placing random objects together. Maybe you have a sense of continuity through the work, simple repetition, or closure, kind of bringing things back together. Then we have contrast and variety. They both deal with differences. It's just the amount. So contrast is when you have two differences. So here we have a smooth side, and then we have a rough side. So that piece has contrast. Down here, we have all these fish floating around in a room, and we have contrast of color. So here we have the orange fish that contrasts with the blue color. You'll notice as I say things, I always say a principle of an element. So here I have contrast of texture, contrast of color. In the other pieces, we have variety. So variety means lots of differences. So here we have a variety of colors. Here we have a variety of textures and lines. Here once again, we have a variety of textures and lines. We have lots of differences in the work. Emphasis. So emphasis and contrast are usually best friends. Emphasis is where you are drawn first. So as the viewer, where do you look first? What grabs your attention? And artists can do that a bunch of different ways. So here, because there's a change, we're drawn to the change. So here we have emphasis of line. Here we have emphasis not only of color, we have emphasis of negative space, and we have emphasis of the change of form. So here we have this very geometric whole in a very organic form. Here, once again, we have emphasis of color, emphasis of size here in the Egyptian hieroglyphic. Everything else is small, and emphasis of negative space, because it's a vast difference here. The one additional thing you can think about is you can have very dominant emphasis, or you can have kind of subordinate emphasis. So something a little subtle that you don't actually notice. You kind of notice it second. And then we have movement. So I know we talked about kinetic earlier. Kinetic, it actually moves. Okay, it actually moves into kinetic work. And when we talk about the principle of movement, though, it's the illusion of motion. So it doesn't actually move. It's how much your eyeballs move. So in this one here, we have two types of movement. We have static and we have dynamic. So static is very restful. It's very peaceful. It's very placid. So the forms here have very graceful, very restful, simple, static movement. Down here, the pieces have a ton of energy. So we have all, our eyes are looking in all sorts of different directions. Therefore, those forms have dynamic movement. Now, I like the bean here from Chicago because the form is very static. It has static movement. Whereas the surface, we definitely have dynamic movement of the surface because you got all the stuff going on in the reflection of the bean. Then we have two types of repetition. So the first one is pattern. So we have a pattern of an element that creates a sense of structure and order. So here at the entrance to the mosque, we have repetition of line and text and all these shapes that creates a sense of pattern. Okay, pattern of line, pattern of color. These pieces here, we have repetition of form to create a pattern, repetition and pattern of line, repetition and pattern of color. So it looks organized, right? It creates a sense of structure. Whereas rhythm, we have repetition, but it creates a sense of movement. So here, this is an apartment building. So we have this repetition of these cubes, but they're not set up normally. So it creates a sense of rhythm. So here we have rhythm of form. Here we have this piece again, rhythm of negative space, rhythm of organic form, rhythm of geometric form, rhythm of kind of linear forms. So different ways to organize your repetition. I think most people are comfortable with this. This is balance. So when you look at the form, how is it arranged? How much visual weight is given to the sides? Now, there is a disclaimer here. Depending on how you look at a piece, it might be symmetrical one way or asymmetrical or radial another way. So it all depends on your vantage point when you experience the sculpture. For instance, these pieces here are symmetrical from this viewpoint, but this piece here, I bet if I look down on it, it might be radial, but the angle presented is symmetrical. Same with these. Asymmetry. So symmetry means the same on both sides. Asymmetry means it doesn't mean no balance. It just means it feels unstable. It just feels like it's getting ready to tip or something dramatic is about to happen. And the sides don't mirror. So with these pieces here, you feel this sense of, could it fall over? And same with the spoon bridge down here. If I look at it from this view, it's asymmetrical, but maybe if I stood at the foot of the bridge and looked up, maybe it's symmetrical, but this view is asymmetrical. And then, of course, radial is based on a circle. So the design kind of radiates out from a center point. So like the rose window here and the mask. And then the last two that I'll talk to you about are scale and proportion. So these both deal with size. So in scale, it's about you and the work. So it's the size between you and how big the work is. So there's two different sizes it can be. It can be handheld, so something you literally hold in your hand where the viewer is really much bigger than the artwork. It can be human scale, like this guy right here. So it's pretty relative to what's going on. And then you can have things that are just absolutely monumental. They are huge. So you can see like the people walking down here, that is not the normal size of a saw. So different, once again, with scale, it's the artwork to the viewer. Proportion deals with size within the work. So sometimes artists do realistic proportions, like this head. It looks realistic. That looks like a guy's head. Or artists deal with exaggerated proportions or purposely disproportion. So Alberto Giacometti was kind of the king of this. So here we've got, normal size kind of feet, but then this huge hip and this huge hand and this little itty bitty head. So he's playing around with exaggerated proportions or disproportion. Same here. This is actually a real person walking, but then this is one of his sculptures. He elongated the forms. So a lot of times they'll do that to draw attention, like emphasis, or evoke an emotion within the form. And those are our elements and principles. So just remember, when we ask you to write a P&E statement, you will always say a principle of an element, whether it's rhythm of form, emphasis of line, contrast of color, repetition of shape. Always the principle first that guides and governs the elements.